Hello and welcome to our Friday webinar. We are on with our very extra special guest because we don't get to see you all the time. It's Dr. Anthony Pilny. Thank you for joining us from outer space, or the outer limits.
My
Um,
pleasure. Thanks for having me.
and we're doing, this is such an intriguing topic, the impact of attachment to pet birds on psychological well-being. So we're gonna, this is kind of a webinar for our birds and ourselves. And so I can't wait to dive into this. Yeah, so if you're just joining us, of course, let us know where you're coming from. I love to see where everyone zooms in with us. And if you have a question, we'll save it for the end. Use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature for those. And wow, okay. All right, Dr. Filney. I think I'm gonna let you start because I have a feeling we're gonna have some questions, and I know you got a lot of good territory that you're gonna cover for us. So I think we should dive in, don't you?
Yes, thank you again for having me and allowing me to present here. Appreciate everything that Lafeber does. As we mentioned, let us know where you're from. For me, greetings from Phoenix, Arizona, where it looks like we're on the cusp of some pretty inclement weather. So, number of storm fronts and a hurricane out in the coast and a lot heading our way. So, those of us living in the desert never complain about rain, but doesn't mean we like hurricanes and terrible weather like that. But um, what I wanted to speak about today, and I wanted to build on the last webinar I presented where we looked at mental health and well-being in birds. And now we're going to kind of switch focus a little bit and look at mental health and well-being in people that have birds and own birds and live with birds and want to understand and have a cherished relationship with those birds. And I became really interested and largely spend a lot of time focusing on pet bird welfare type of issues. And one of those issues that birds are facing is relinquishment or rehoming, abandonment. They've become one of the more common pets that people will look to rehome or give away, or for some reason are just unable to keep them after a certain period of time. And the secondary part of that are the rescues and the sanctuaries are full. And so that creates a unique situation. Where do these birds go? What are we going to do with them? The other welfare cord that comes from that are that dog and cat shelters are now being forced to take in unwanted birds. So we've got a situation where birds are going into shelters and they are extremely ill-equipped to be able to support and care for pet birds. So what I hope to do here is just talk a little bit about the impact of our attachment to birds, and maybe somewhere while we explore that unique relationship, maybe it'll help us kind of understand a little bit more about what's going on with birds and largely how do we continue to improve pet bird welfare overall. So we've always loved birds. I mean, our history goes back through the millennia, keeping birds as long as 3,000 years ago based on records and cave paintings and hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. Birds have always had a cultural significance and have even been used as status symbols where they were kept by the elite as a sign of wealth. In Egypt, they symbolize communication, and other cultures have used birds to symbolize messengers of good news, or they are symbols of freedom and beauty. Historically, cage birds were even served as companions in Victorian homes in aristocratic settings. So it was a sign of wealth and a sign that you could acquire something that other people couldn't. And so that really elevated the status of birds that kind of brought us to today, our modern companionship. We want these birds to be seen as cherished members of the family. But what I really want to do is understand why. And so what I'll do as I go through this lecture is it's somewhat, I don't want to say psychology because I'm not a psychiatrist, psychologist, or psychotherapist, but I do want to look at the psychology of pet birds and our attachment. But I didn't want it to be heavily, boringly scientific. So I've extrapolated a lot of the science into a more user-friendly version. And then I'll go over it as we talk through. So, really, what is this all about? As of today, we know that there are very few actual legitimate scientific studies evaluating pet bird attachment and how that relates to our psychological well being. There's lots of literature on dogs and cats and lots of studies in other animals, but most of what we know in birds is really either anecdotal or anthropomorphic. And I know we talk about anthropomorphism where we place human traits on animals, and that's what most people will do. If you were asked, why do you keep a pet bird or why do you like birds? Many people answer with anthropomorphic things that relate to putting human characteristics on them. They're my best friend, or I like the way they talk and mimic, things like that. But there is some new literature, there are new studies, and there is some new interesting data coming out that shows that in some people, more attachment to a pet bird actually relates to more feelings of loneliness. And I think that's something that we should explore because we know that people will get pets to fill a void when they're lonely. And we know that sometimes that's a positive thing, but sometimes that's a negative thing. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's also important to understand that some of the science is teaching us that a strong attachment to a pet bird is not necessary to get all the benefits of companionship. And so we have to think, will that benefit our pet birds in the long run? And will the understanding that you don't have to be so bonded and have such a strong relationship and still get all the pleasure and joy out of keeping a bird? So, we explore this connection and we look at the ancient practice that is believed to still currently enhance human well-being. Birds are valued for their beauty, for their intelligence, for their companionship, and understanding the human-bird bond is what improves animal welfare and enriches our lives, the very origins of why we would keep pets. And it's interesting because when you read these studies and you look to the literature, a lot of it tends to be survey based, where they'll ask, say, 2,000 bird owners a series of questions and then assimilate that information. And some people actually think that their relationships with birds are stronger than that of mammals, dogs and cats, maybe even farm animals or a horse. And even some people are known to think that birds could be a better companion. Now, of course, that may be biased. If you happen to be somebody who loves birds, maybe you're somebody who doesn't like to keep pet cats. If I asked you on a survey, well, then we know what your results are going to be. But let's pluck out the real important parts of it, and make sure that it's not a situation like this quote here, where some people have a very strong attachment. So why birds? Why did we decide a long time ago? Well, we've talked about some of the reasons, but what about the psychology of the bond? What does that mean? Well, birds can have a therapeutic effect. Interacting with them can reduce our stress and anxiety and provide more of a calming environment. They're intelligent. People often say they love the idea that they mimic sounds and words. That's completely relatable for most people, and they'll feel strong connections. Being around a pet of any kind, including a bird, can combat feelings of loneliness. We know that with cognitive engagement, these highly intelligent birds stimulate us. If you live with birds that come up with problems for us, if you've ever, like I have, lived with a bird that figured out how to open their own cage door or figured out how to take those food bowls and throw them on the ground, and they come up with really intelligent ways to engage with us. But think about empathy and altruism. People who have birds may actually have a higher level of empathy. There may be a way to understand other emotions. They may be more communally minded. And I think that's an important thing to understand. And then a sense of purpose. Now, people might argue that pets are not supposed to create purpose. They're not there, but that is something that most people feel. Caring for a pet, and especially a long-lived companion, will give owners a sense of purpose. And, we've probably all heard about people wanting to get a pet bird for a widow or widower or a grandparent that lives alone and provide them some companionship. And that's one thing, but caring for that animal on a different level is a whole sense of purpose. And that's very enjoyable for people. I'm sure most people on this call that have birds, and that's one of the things that people have said to me throughout points in my lifetime where my pet bird numbers have been excessive by some people's standards and have kept a lot of them, but I thoroughly enjoyed caring for them. I thoroughly enjoyed making chop. I thoroughly enjoyed keeping them clean and making sure that they're hygienic and just really caring for them. So it's really important to understand communication is key. And that's sort of default for everything going on in our interpersonal relationships. But what about our relationship with a non-human? Communication is key. And many people are famous for saying, we don't know how to communicate with birds. They're just too foreign still. We don't know how to actually talk on their level. We can't actually effectively relay things to them. We can train them, but can we communicate? Nonverbal communication and understanding what birds do. Some obvious examples we think about, pinning the pupils. We think birds are excited. They're worked up, but if it's an Amazon parrot doing that, you might not want to avoid giving your hand for a step up at that moment. So really reading those cues and understanding, levels of communication is vital. Vocalizations as well. One of the big things that people want birds for are their vocalizations, their ability to mimic human speech. You hear people all the time, I want a bird that talks. I'm interested in a bird that talks. And we say, well, mimicry or voice, simulation. But, there's a whole range of what we look at with vocalization, including some of those negative aspects of it. Screaming is in the top 3 reasons why people give a bird away, and they just won't have that in their home anymore. So we really have to understand what these birds are saying, what they're doing, and how do we learn to communicate with them? How do we build trust? How do we speak their language? I mean, it requires patience. It requires letting birds have some freedom and free will and initiating contact on their level. It's okay for them to have some boundaries. It's okay for them to have some, rules of their own for how they engage with us. It doesn't negate training and it doesn't negate choice. It just means positive reinforcement is so important. And the key part of all of this is how do we empower the bird and how do we strengthen our bond? And how do we understand that? We all want this deep and then rewarding connection to birds. Birds on the mind, bird brains, all these type of terms we hear because the bond with the bird is complex and it's very deeply rooted on mutual communication and mutual trust. We know, and we'll talk a little bit more about how birds offer mental and emotional benefits beyond companionship, but it's a long-term commitment to meet their needs for health, for space, and for their own mental well-being as well. So let's look a little bit about the social dimensions of the human-avian bond with us parrots and people. They're among the most popular companion pets, but little research has actually been done to focus on the human companion parrot or the human avian bond when we look at it, like I said earlier, beyond an anecdotal way of viewing it. But I think this is really interesting, these central bullet points, because various patterns of human-bird interactions emerge from the scientific literature. Childhood experiences with birds and how that relates to adult experiences. Affection and physical contact. Some people want that, some people crave that, and some people don't need it. And some of us have birds that don't need that from us. The bird seen as a family member versus a bird that's seen as a pet. Infantilization comes up, and this is a psychological term where pets are turned into surrogate children, where people are actually almost looking at them beyond a member of the family and have elevated them to the level of like a child. And we hear this all the time now in social media. People refer to their dogs as their fur baby, and we hear expressions like that. But infantilization, anthropomorphism, and what level of that do people have? Celebrating with our pets, having a birthday party for your bird, and really dealing with certain aspects of keeping them and not misinterpreting their behavior. Cognition and understanding, and then anthropocentrism is the bird as an object more than it as a living sentient being. So any misinterpretation of bird behavior, any failure to recognize the psychological and social needs leads to impaired welfare. But on the other hand, according the bird, a social status as a cherished family member should enhance their welfare. And I think that's a key part of what we're looking at here. How does our attachment with birds impair their welfare, and how does it enhance their welfare? And then how do we make sure we look at what it does for us? So this is just a list of what we consider the psychological benefits of keeping birds and pets. And there's a little bit of of subjectivity here when it's specifically to a bird. But again, anybody that has a pet bird knows that they offer social interaction and should reduce feelings of loneliness. They can elevate moods, lower stress, stimulate cognitive function for us, as we talked about before. Many owners will develop a very strong emotional attachment to a bird. People who don't own birds are often, critique the way people who have never owned, say, a snake or a reptile. They don't understand how you can have that bond. Some people need fur to bond, and some people think dogs and cats are pets, and everything else, they just don't understand how you can develop that emotional attachment. So, contact with pets of all kinds has been studied. We know that can lower blood pressure, can lower heart rate. Bringing cats into a nursing home and letting people pet them can drop blood pressure. We've seen these stories about how pets are used to help children speak when they won't talk to anybody. And then they'll suddenly sometimes find that they'll speak to the animal when they won't talk to people. Interestingly, the sound of chirping and mimicry can promote relaxation. And if any of you are like me and you won't live without a canary or two or many in your home, and you love that sound, I just had a house guest staying with me for a conference, and the canary singing, and it was somebody who is not used to that. And they were so enamored with the beautiful canary song. And I said, well, now you give me a chance to say what I always say. I don't want to spend a day on this earth without a canary in my home. So that sound can really do something for you. And I know the joy I experience when I hear that. And then interaction provokes positive responses from birds like we see in other pet patient or pet relationships. And I think that's what's really important. But again, we have to think about sort of a price to pay. It's a high commitment and very specialized needs. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This can be the subject of many other talks, but some of the things we have to consider, the long lifespan of many parrots does require planning, and it does require a long-term commitment. Financial and time commitment, sometimes some people will see that as a burden. I have a friend recently who told me they rehomed their budgies because they were too messy. They were making too much of a mess in their home, and they just decided they didn't want to deal with that. But they need special veterinary care. They need good food, toys, enrichment, and time for interaction. The other problem is behavioral issues that develop. We know that that is, again, the subject of 500 more webinars and many that have already been presented. But behavior problems are a serious concern, but they can be worked with and worked through. The safety in the environment they live in, we have to guard their safety, and of course, noise. Like I said earlier, screaming and noise is one of the biggest reasons people will choose to not keep a parrot once it's been in their home, sometimes after a very short period of time. So a little bit about the bond and what have we learned? What do people who have strong bonds with birds teach us? What has the literature, what have has sort of the psychological aspects of how we nurture a bond with something that's not a human? Of course, enrichment is essential. We know that's again a topic and a word that comes up with pet birds, but we've got to provide that enrichment. We've got to make sure they have appropriate housing. I like to say no cage is big enough. Do the best you can. If you can convert a garage or a spare bedroom, great. If you can build an outdoor aviary that's safe and predator proof, excellent. Think about how we provide the best. Routine and stability. Many birds are used to a routine and they get used to it so much so they train themselves on it. Half my clients say when their birds are ready, they put themselves to bed when it gets dark. They find their way, they're just ready to go to sleep. And then again, that's it. So a predictable routine helps reduce stress. Addressing those behavior problems when they come up. Certainly, we have to be careful what we do. And, it's sad that sometimes when somebody may be at a point where they have a challenging relationship with a pet bird, some of the behavior and attitudes and the things they do in the weeks and months leading up to potentially um, wanting to rehome that bird may make things worse. And we've probably all heard the story of the bird in their fourth or fifth home. There may be some behavioral aspects in that bird. There may have been a lot of it encouraged, and part of it may have just been some of those were the wrong home. I mean, it's a fact that not all pets make good pets, but It's also a fact that we sometimes make some of these pets worse as they work through, and we need to address these behavioral problems. And then, of course, ethical acquisition, supporting rescues, adopting from sanctuaries, adoption programs, just thinking about that as part of the global balance of what we're doing and trying to make sure these birds get good homes. So the bond process, again, daily interaction, understanding communication cues, patience and positive reinforcement, and then over time, letting that bond unfold and develop and ensure that those birds, which we know recognize their owners, seek their company, and want to have that bond and relationship with us. I'm not getting into when that bond gets a little bit too sexy and when that bond gets into a very strong bond where now we're thinking of a family and raising some kids and that type of thing. But I'm just talking about the healthy, normal bond that we all want. And we recognize in birds behavioral indicators of that bond, wanting to be with us, that closeness, that allowance of physical touch, vocalizations directed towards us, grooming, allo grooming, preening us sometimes. Sometimes that gets a little excessive. If you go on YouTube, you'll see birds that will clean teeth. I'm not saying that I'd recommend that, but they'll get their beak in there and they might they might perform some dental cleaning for their owners. But a relaxed body language, a willingness to be handled, a lack of fear, and a lack of anxiety is key to that strong bond. And then remember the ethical considerations. We mentioned these earlier, but provide what they need, recognize and understand their natural behavior, don't force anything on them that almost never works, and respect their needs for social interaction and, of course, mental stimulation. Key parts, key points, and everything we understand that's relative to how to keep these birds happy. Again, we've already touched a little bit, but reminder of the challenges of that bond, behavioral issues that do develop. Long lifespan means that we have to make sure we have a long-term commitment. Birds are susceptible to health problems. It's going to cost for veterinary care, and sometimes that can be expensive and something people should plan for. It can be really difficult for people. They may have a very strong bond with a pet bird, but may not have the finances for expensive veterinary care. And it's twice as debilitating for them when they can't afford the care and have to make other decisions. So just ensure that that bond remains healthy and involves ongoing education and really involves that sense of patience. And again, kind of summarizing, the studies show that pet birds can improve emotional health in owners. Research indicates that interaction with birds, much like with furred animals, dogs and cats, will reduce anxiety, reduce depression, create a feeling of community, and anecdotal information highlights that birds will develop similar, strong, and what's I think really important, unique attachments to their owners. And that's what we're all striving for. So again, how do we enhance the bond with a bird? Spend quality time together, of course, training, reading to them, or just any form of interaction. Sometimes playing music or singing, whistling, talking back to them, engaging them in their own communication, offering and hand feeding treats. I mean, that's an excellent way to train birds, but it's also an excellent way to ensure that bond. I mean, we certainly hear people talk about, feeding with love, but there's a healthy way to do that, and it reinforces that bond. Um, Teaching birds tricks and training. We can't underestimate the value of training. And it's interesting because when people who keep pet birds are asked versus people who have never had a bird, people who haven't owned birds would never think you would train a bird. They might take their puppy to obedience classes to teach it to sit and stay and roll over. But to train a bird, what a crazy concept. And we all know that that's really important. That's part of the bond. That's part of good welfare, but it's also part of making them a good pet. And so thinking about all the ways to enhance that bond, several other ways that we think about include physical or non-physical contact, and then keeping those set routines so that we know that these birds are always in that sort of space where they value the bond as much as we do. Again, kind of reiterating it in a simpler sense, but spend time, ensure there's that stimulating environment, maintain a really good diet, clean habitat, clean habits, and then respect their boundaries. This I thought was really interesting, and it's somewhat funny, but in a way, some of the early research where when psychiatrists started looking into how animals could benefit people, they also started looking into how birds play a role in that. And there was a group of researchers who wanted to look at the response of patients in psychiatric hospitals. And they wanted to see how they responded to caged birds in their group sessions. They had daily group therapy, and they wanted to see if that would do anything. So they basically had two groups of people. And one group, they had finches or cage birds brought into the room. And the other group, they didn't have the birds. And they evaluated how people interacted and what they did over time. And the outcome basically showed significant improvement in numbers of attendance. People wanted to be in the room with the birds. The people who weren't in the room with the birds wanted to be in the room with the birds. They participated more in activities. They were more outgoing, more talkative. And what was really important to these people is that there was less hostility in the group that had the birds. So, the researchers were looking at this and finding that just the presence of those birds had a serious mental effect on these people in a very positive way. But the fun part of it is they had to terminate the study early because all the people in the bird group were getting better and leaving the hospital. And so they actually found out that after a short amount of time and due to substantial and unprecedented numbers of discharges of people, they were finding that the people that were interacting or in the areas with the bird were getting discharged from the psychiatric ward and improved and healthier. And the only variable was the presence of some birds in a cage. And I think that says a lot. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Um, Again, focusing a bit more on the psychological needs filled by birds, surveys that are typically done, and one of them where they asked 80 pet bird owners specifically about what they thought were psychological needs that a bird might fill, exploring the nature of their relationship through extensive questionnaires. And results indicated that birds would fill social, self-esteem, and cognitive needs in people. Birds fell into the category of social needs, and that most people wanted the ability to give the bird love and affection. That became important to them. Having a pet bird was something that not only was in the cage, not only was something that maybe they would take to a play stand and leave it there for a couple hours, but they had a need to give the bird love and affection. And I think that's a key thing to why we bond with anything. But I think that's a key part of what could go wrong with some of the negative sides of that pet bird bond. Almost 60% of the people thought that birds added more meaning to their lives. And again, that's just based on these individuals. If you selected a certain group, like if we polled everybody on this webinar, we probably would get 100% of people feel like these, birds add meaning to their lives. But again, that's a pretty significant number, and it does prove what we speculated. Birds are fun. And you know what's really neat? In a lot of these psychological studies, the fact that birds could make people laugh was a recurrent and key part of why people value their birds. There's something about the bird's behavior, be it mimicry. Certainly, if you meet any of those birds, and you can YouTube this, that have learned some naughty words, and they've learned to say some things that are maybe less than appropriate, but of course it makes everybody laugh. If you've ever met laughing Amazon parrots, they laugh, you laugh, they laugh more, the owners laugh, and everybody's laughing. Laughing is infectious, but the fact that birds can mimic a sound like laughing makes us laugh. And the fact that they do a lot of things, playing, clowning around, silly behaviors. You've probably seen some of those videos of the kayaks dancing across the counters, or the Quakers that play basketball and they ride a skateboard. And making us laugh is such a key thing, and birds can do that, and that strengthens the bond and makes us care about them more. And then, of course, the classic one is the ability to mimic, the fact that they speak to us, they say things. Many of them are trained to answer. You've seen some of those incredible videos. There's, some of the work that Irene Pepperberg has done in the past and continues. This African gray Einstein, these birds learning abstract concepts, learning zero, learning so many different things, but the ability to talk and recognize, and you've probably seen it. You ask the bird, what does the cow say? And they go moo. And what does the duck say? And they go quack quack. And then it's entertaining, but it fills a psychological need. So when we think about what is the value of all of this, what do all these psychological studies tell us? I mean, social change is key. And there's data in these experiments regarding people's responses and why they feel attached and why they do not feel attached to their birds. And maybe as we advance the science and we focus on social improvement and social change, maybe we could really start looking at why people don't feel attached to a bird and what that means for these birds and sort of the future welfare. The goal in all of this, and the reason I'm here today, is these areas can be used as educational measures. Just like we were chatting before this webinar started, measures for new bird owners, measures for individuals. Individuals can include people that may have mental or health problems, that measures that may enhance that bond, and then agencies that work with birds, anybody in any capacity. This could be rescue birds, this could be a huge sanctuary, a small sanctuary, this could be a bird pet store, or anybody that works with rehoming birds, anybody that works with selling birds, breeders. The impetus for social change and the validity for it is going to come from our deeper understanding, and that's what we're hoping to get out of a lot of this. Again, implications for social change will open enormous possibilities for the inclusion of birds as a respected companion animal. Birds can exist in the household as emotional support animals. We've seen that as well. It was a little out of hand when it was a full-size emotional support peacock getting on that Delta flight, but just the same, birds can function as emotional support animals. And I have clients and I have met people who are handicapped or wheelchair bound, and have found that these birds provide an enormous resource for them. Again, service animals, birds can learn to retrieve objects. They can actually help owners. The classic example, of course, we think about dogs being able to get their owner's medication when they're having a hypoglycemic crisis or things like that. But birds can be trained and work in a service capacity, especially with anybody that is handicapped. And they can present as sort of a replacement of a family member or fill a void. And there's a healthy way to do that and an unhealthy way. The healthy way is by respecting those boundaries and understanding that bond goes both ways. The key thing with birds as well is it can never be one-sided. They're too smart, they're too intelligent, and they're too capable. Keep that bond and keep that balance going both directions. Interestingly, there are studies that show that the pets that people often keep as adults are the ones they kept as children. I didn't realize till I read this a couple weeks ago, but I'm one of those. So, growing up with birds and having a lot of them and, living with them, and it has never stopped all these years later. So, a published study, actually, they looked at it to investigate the influence of childhood experience with pets. Now, they did look at dogs and cats, but then there's a subsequent study where they looked at birds, and people who are more likely to own birds as an adult own them as kids. And I can tell you in veterinary practice, when owners come in with a new pet bird, I will always ask them, why'd you get a bird? What made you do this? Have you had birds before? And I almost always get yes, we had parakeets when I was a kid, or we had a cockatiel, or my college roommate had a kayik or something. And so people will look at these influences, and we need to not undervalue those. When they looked at studies of why adults kept pet birds and linked it back to early childhood experiences, and that they kept birds when they were younger, they found that people who own birds were socially outgoing and more expressive than people who didn't. And whether it's okay to say or not, just sharing the data, they found that female bird owners were more dominant minded, had a bit stronger, more dominant behaviors, more assertive, and it gave them sort of a little bit of an edge there that was noticeable amongst those people who did not keep pet birds. And of course, that may be a function of certain pet birds, but just the same, childhood experiences are going to influence adult attitudes. So, kind of nearing towards the end, why is the human avian bond so intense? Well, I hope that we've answered it in a few ways, but other research shows that it has to do with the capacity to imitate speech and what people often interpret as speaking cognitively. And we've mentioned that several times before, but it's a recurring theme in the psychology literature. In addition, the long lifespan. When you have something for a long time, when you've owned a pet, barring any reasons why that pet leaves earlier than what is its natural lifespan, is really important. And I love when somebody comes in and says, "Yeah, I got the bird when I was in fifth grade, and now they are, you know, 47 years old." And so it's really kind of interesting that people make that connection. And so a person having the same companion bird for a long time creates an intense bond. And those are the people who have, just by virtue of having had it a long time, have lived with them, have understood them. You know, people talk a lot. I talk a lot about some pets that I have lived with me now at 7 different addresses as I've moved in my lifetime to different places. And they come with me. And so they just, by virtue of that, we have them a long time and it creates an intense feeling, an intense bond. Um, it's not a parrot, but I recently lost a pet snake that I had for 23 years. And, I'll be one of those people who is honest. The bond with a snake is very different than a lot of other pets. I loved her. I cared for her very deeply, but so much of what the loss and my emotional experience and her passing away of natural causes was longevity. I just had her for so long. I cared for her for so long. I cleaned and fed and housed her. And when you compare that to birds and you have them a really long time, it creates that bond and it makes it really intense. Again, we're all family in our birds' relationships. As in other human companion animal relationships, birds are relative as family. They're included in everything we do. I know, like I said, people who take their birds on vacation, they wouldn't think of not doing it. I know people who have a country home or a summer home, and they've got an identical cage set up there so that the bird can come with them and go on vacation. I know people that take their birds on car rides because they believe the birds enjoy it. It's sort of a fun aspect for them. Maybe the bird wants to go for a car ride because they're running to the Starbucks drive-through to get a pumpkin spice latte. It's all part of that bond and it's all part of how we care about them. Birds can be mentioned in obituaries. The death of a pet is equated to the loss that we experience in a lot of other ways. Losing any pet, losing a family member, losing anything that we're bonded to, um, can be really devastating. And we should not minimize the individual person's experience with bird loss, the individual person's experience when they lose a bird they may have had 30 or 40 years. And each individual's form of grieving is unique and special to them. But again, birds have been elevated to that same level of loss and that same level of grieving when they leave us. And I did just want to mention this, the owner-bird relationship scale. Basically, and we've talked about it a bit, there's no psychometric scale to actually measure the human-avian relationship. How do you scientifically do that? We can answer questions. Why do you like birds? Why are you bonded with your birds? Why do you care for your birds? But how do we scientifically measure it? And then we have this scale that was developed, and it's an attempt to measure the relationship between the owner and their pet birds. And it's used in standardized empirical studies to actually measure the relationship and quantify it and really have some scientific validity to it. Applications include bird welfare studies, which I think is really interesting, and then compliance of bird owners to veterinary therapy, which is another whole area that is looked at. I mean, our governing veterinary groups let us know spending habits with pets, how many people are going for emergency care, how many people are committed to the finances involved in that, but what about an actual scale to look at it? And then to test and develop the scale to add to our knowledge about the owner-bird relationship across species, across cultures. There's a huge cultural diversity in the keeping of pet birds and how people respect and think of them and what level of family member status they go to. So this opens up implications for that as well. And the results of the initial studies provide insight into how we characterize relationship with birds. The basic requirements for a relationship are met: interdependence, interaction, and personal identity. Three really important words we can apply to our relationships with anything, but they apply to birds, and we were able to prove that. The existence of the relationship with a human and a pet bird can meet the criteria of what we believe is a relationship. And I think that's really neat. It's varied and it's multifaceted. It involves several dimensions. And I think people understanding that when it is multifaceted, the tendency of the owner to anthropomorphize, the social support, empathy and respect towards the bird, and the relationship of the bird to the owner. And those are the sort of the key findings in when psychiatrists look at what is truly a relationship that works for both parties in a healthy way. And guess what? Birds do that. They do it for us. And I love that. So just narrowing down, what about their point of view? What about the bird's point of view in all this? So we've talked about the psychology of the human bird bond and the human pet bird attachment. We all know why we love birds. We know why we care for them. We know why we want to ensure their welfare. But what about from a bird's point of view? And I don't know that we'll ever know for sure. But again, the relationship with birds is just as complex as with any other pet. And we might say a dog is not a cat, is not a bird, is not a fish, but what they all have in common, key point, the absence of a uniform relationship. So stop trying to have one. The absence of a uniform relationship is what makes birds amazing and diverse and interesting and exciting. Every relationship is as unique as the two individuals involved. I'm sure everyone on here, myself included, we all have some unique characteristics, some quirky personality facets. There's something about us that our relationships with others are going to be based on us and them. So it depends on a lot of things, but in bold at the bottom of this slide here, we need a collaboration between behavioral biologists, sociologists, psychiatrists, bird lovers, bird owners, bird experts, all of the people in this entire community to come together and look at the relationship from the point of view of the pet. And I would love to see that. I mean, I would love to know what my birds think of me. I may never find out, but until then, I'm going to make up what I think it is. And I know they love me intensely and value their lives with me. Haha. So some future directions. Advances in technology will enhance human-bird interactions. Increased research on both the psychological and the physiological benefits. Like I said, we know that simply hearing birdsong might drop your heart rate. We know that the opportunity to interact with a bird. We know that when people have never been around birds and somebody says, here, have my macaw step up on your arm, and they want to take pictures and they have that first time engagement, it's a level of excitement. It's a level of some new experiences that change our brain chemistry in some ways and can make us happier. Feelings of positive excitement make us happier, and birds are doing that. And then educational programs to promote ethical and informed pet ownership. And that's the basis of where we hope this subset of research leads us to is, of course, improved and increased pet bird welfare. So, in conclusion, the human pet bird bond offers a lot of mutual benefits rooted in our trust, in our ability to learn how to speak their language, and the level of care we provide them. Respect, patience, and understanding are key to these relationships. They're key to any relationship, and we work with the uniqueness. We work with our uniqueness, and we work with what's so special and amazing about birds. And then again, understanding that ethical pet bird ownership enhances the well-beings of us and the well-being of our birds. And that's what we need to strive for in all our interactions. And we need to strive for always improved and increased pet bird welfare. And that's what I have for you today. Thanks for your attention. You're
Sorry, I
muted.
had to unmute myself. That was amazing. Thank you. It's kind of like it's kind of like that feeling too when you go to like a bird conference or a bird any kind of bird related event. There's like this overpowering compan you're around people that get what you that your interest in birds, and that's I was just thinking about that. It's like one of the feelings that you get, and that's why those are so meaningful too, is because you're very rarely surrounded by people who have the same kind of feelings for birds that you do. And so it's kind of like we're fostering that online here. But yeah, that was amazing. And I was just remembering that quote from Mark Twain, and it kind of just reminded me of what's that famous quote? She was not quite what you would call refined. She was not quite what you would call unrefined. She was the kind of person that keeps a parrot. Because
That's
you
perfect.
mentioned that.
Yeah, I have a friend who has that as their email signature as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Very,
funny. Yeah, I'm sure.
very fitting. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of with the stats that you had. And okay, so we do have a comment. So this is from Frank. So a clinical psychologist wrote a book, Birds of a Feather, about her success in treating PTSD military with parrots coming in from difficult situations and bonding, which it's a great they suggest as a great read for people. Kind of like the VA in Los Angeles, they have that parrot, or at least I'm not sure if it's still around that. They have a where they connect veterans with parrots at that facility over there, if I recall. It's like I'm sure that's helping with some PTSD as well. That was fascinating. That was a really interesting look. I'm curious to know. I can count myself as one of them who had birds when they're little. I'm a little budgie. I wanted that. That was my Christmas. That was my Christmas top list when I was in 5 years old, and I was fascinated with them. I just saw Budgie, and it's still my favorite thing I've ever had the chance of having as a Christmas gift. It's like, but yeah, my little green budgie Fred, that was my childhood pet. So it's an interesting connection that you make. And you mentioned that you came from a childhood of birds as well, right?
Yeah, many people had the budgies as sort of the starter birds or the cage birds or that type of thing. Yeah, and that's a very similarly shared experience for people. For us, it started off as a couple of budgies and then a couple more, and then a decision to convert a room in the house for the budgies, so they would have their own room in the home. And then it just kind of exploded from there. And then it was like, well, now it's time to move bigger. So people graduate to the cockatiel size, and
Yes.
it just kind of goes from there. And so it's an interesting phenomenon to see that that's what shapes people's future interests.
Okay, so we have a question. Is there any way that they can prepare their little budgie for boarding with a stranger for 2 weeks while they go away on vacation? Little budgie, how do you keep them feeling at home while you're away?
Right. Well, two ways. One of those is routines and structure, which we mentioned here, and we know that birds do prefer some degree of a routine type of schedule. So hopefully somebody's able to keep things on par to some degree. We're not going to change too much. People often say, can they stay in their own cage? Can they keep their own toys? Can I keep everything set up to keep it as familiar as possible for them? And that promotes that familiarity that's going to decrease their stress. And the second way is some people may think it's a bit extreme because birds tend to be very adaptive as well, but just making sure they're used to whatever the environment is, whether they're going somewhere else, whether it's somebody coming to the home to care for them, if they're going to a boarding facility, if they're going to a boarding facility in a bird store, get them used to it. I mean, I've had people who are nervous about boarding their birds in a boarding facility, so they'll start early with a weekend visit, and then just take the birds over for maybe 2 days and then pick them up and then bring them back a week later for a little bit longer and actually condition them to it. Birds are smart. They know what's going on. They figure this out. They're very adaptive. when things are done the right way, it should just result in a positive outcome for them. There are also behaviorists out there who'd argue that we need to challenge our birds in these ways. We need to make them have more experiences. We need to, create forms of enrichment, and maybe a little bit of healthy stress is not the worst thing. Ideally, that's not something that should result in any physical or mental harm, but it might just be a little bit scary at first. So think about how we could desensitize them into tolerating that.
Okay. Okay. I wonder if some birds, because my dog, for example, when he sees my suitcase come out, he knows I'm going somewhere, and he
Mhm.
kind of you can see this change in his behavior. He kind of like starts barking like he wants to come outside with it because he knows I'm going somewhere when he sees that my particular orange suitcase that I use usually when I travel. And I imagine our birds would be similar to that, right? Like they clue in on you packing up or getting ready for a trip. And I wonder if that's something that should try to do a little more in advance, kind of prep them for the week, like, or day of, or that, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, anything you do that helps with adjustment is a benefit, no matter how we have to do that. So, yeah, and people will probably say that they're, common even just now, where somebody's saying their bird knows when they're about to leave. They know when they're coming home. I used to live in New York City, and um, I could hear one of my conures from 4 blocks away, as I got close enough to home. And my neighbors all said that it coincided with me coming home. And there have been studies about pets and their owners. There's really interesting studies where, owners are still miles away, but then the pet suddenly, the dog jumps and goes and waits by the door, but the person is not pulling in the garage or in the driveway. They're still miles away. And they've done that. And I would be like, okay, so are you just screaming the whole time I'm away and I'm going to get evicted? And they're like, no, just seems to coincide with when you're on your way home from work. So, yeah, they understand those things, and there's probably a deeper meaning behind it. And I do appreciate, comments people are saying there's a lot to digest and a lot to think about. And, gives you some different avenues, and that's what we're trying to do here, is globally expand our relationship with birds because they're such incredible creatures.
Wow. Yes. And then we had a question. So they say that your talk mentioned intersubjectivity and the problem caused by regarding birds as objects. So do we have any evidence indicating whether birds regard us as thinking and feeling beings? Birds' opinions of us. Like what?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because that's the million-dollar question we have about all of our interactions with non-humans. I mean, that those are the things that we want to know, and especially about birds. And that's why I added that their point of view part, because how do we actually ever know that? I mean, science hasn't figured out how to know what they're thinking and feeling. And this goes back to when we anthropomorphize and people say, "Oh, my bird is angry at me for being away all day." And we say, "Well, do they experience anger? Do they know what anger is? Is anger a human developed emotion? Or do they truly feel what we would consider to be anger?" And we don't know that we'll ever know what they really experience. It's the same example that I bring up about birds and recognition of gender. When people say, "Oh, my bird likes men better," or "My bird's afraid of women," and we say, "But do birds understand human gender? Do they know what a human male is versus a human female?" So that's a great question, and I don't know how science is ever going to come up with it, but I would look forward to knowing that. How do we really know what goes on in the mind of a bird, really what they're thinking, and how it works coming kind of both ways? And I think that's why we have to look at their point of view.
Oh yeah, I think of like your tr dogs and cats. Like dogs seem to you're in most cases they what people say they view you as the alpha, right? They're queuing off of you. If you're the main one who feeds them, takes them out for walks, plays with them, then you're like their person. Cats kind of like I hear you, I just choose not to respond to you sometimes.
Right.
And then birds, where do birds fall? Like do you think our companion birds think of us as the leader, as a flock mate? I mean, I know there's where do you think we fall in that line of thinking?
There's probably a lot of them, as I mentioned here in reviewing when we look really into the psychology of bonding with other things, even other people, it takes both aspects of each unique person or animal on either end of the bond to really sort through that. And then that's where you kind of get more towards what creates that bond and what is it about each individual that really allows that relationship to develop over time. Yeah,
Okay, I
that's
love
like
this comment that Rebecca, that their cockatoos, they historically mess with their pet sitter because they know that they can confuse they can confuse and trick people. It's
yeah.
kind of
And it's interesting too, because when we talk about the ways that we display our bond with people, and there's a comment there from Pam. It says, "I tell my birds every time I go to the store and reassure them I'll be home soon." And it's kind of cute. I do that all the time too. Like, I'll be like, just running to Trader Joe's. I'll be back in 20 minutes. We just let them know things. I mean, a lot of times too, I mean, I let my cats know everywhere I'm going. It's kind of funny because I think speaking to all of our pets is an important thing. I mean, just casual conversation, though we do it as pet owners and pet lovers, it is part of the bond, but it's also part of informal training. And it's an interesting sort of phenomenon when they necessarily can't talk back. But I think a lot of pet owners in surveys have said they like to tell their pets. I mean, I warn my pets if I'm going on vacation, I'll be like, I'll see you in 5 days. They're just kind of looking at me, but I'm like, I'll see you in 5 days.
yeah. Chris Davis, she used to always like recommend and just she would count out how many days she's going to be gone to the birds. Like I'm going to be gone 5 days, and she'd count out, show them the number on her hand so that they would get used to seeing that, seeing what that number is. I love this for Dorothy says it tells the budgies to guard the house because budgies can make effective guard birds.
That's a cute one. Yeah, watch the home while I'm away.
Oh, that's adorable. Wow, this is amazing. Like people were, I don't know, yeah, like someone said they didn't expect to feel so touched by. I mean, they didn't know how much this topic was gonna touch them, and it's touched a lot of us. Um, it's such a deep dive into the emotional well-being of us and our birds and the connections that we have. It's so man, thank you. You have such thought-provoking topics that
Thanks.
historically with us. I hope we're on this roll for another one coming up. We'll have to see what next topic you can come up with that
Yeah, we'll build on a theme. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I got announced today's giveaway winner, and guess what? It's gonna be pumpkin spice berries, and that's gonna go out to Tilly Morris. Congratulations! Another Lafeber product of your bird's choosing. You're gonna get the pumpkin spice berries and another Lafeber product. Yeah, and so taste the fall, right? I don't know any birds that have not liked pumpkin spice berries yet. Word on the street is that it's very good. And let's see, I got to give a sneak preview for our what's our next one. We're still in October. And let's see, what do we have next? Sorry, hold on 1 second. I would just give us a sneak preview for our next one is going to be the look back at the AAV conference, and that'll be with your colleague, Dr. Stephanie Lamb. So she's going to give us next the rundown, the lowdown of what went down at AAV, and that was last weekend, right? AAV just took place, right?
Yep. Yep. Just Friday to Monday just passed. Yep.
And that was in your neck of the woods. It was in
Yeah.
Arizona. Yeah.
First time ever in my life of going to veterinary conferences for 30 years. That one was actually in my home city.
Wow. So no hotel. You just drove through.
I drove back and forth. Yeah, I mean, I had to drive back forth every day, but no airfare, no hotel. Saved a little from my CE fund to now go to another conference.
Oh, that's great. And this is such an exciting recap because there's you guys they're like this is where all of the people who love and care for our birds, the meeting of the minds, AAV, Association of Avian Veterinarians, they all come together, and it's from what I imagine, what I hear, that's like where there's big takeaways for each of you, and you guys pick each other's brains and breakthroughs, and just it's just it sounds like an amazing thing that you guys do every year. So.
Yeah, and that's what I call when you attend these conferences or they're highly scientific, you're looking for those like clinically relevant pearls of wisdom. Somebody teaching you something or sharing something or just a system of learning. And that's what it is, learning and growth.
Wow. Okay. Okay. On that note, guys, so join us next Friday with Dr. Lamb. She'll give us the rundown, the lowdown of AAV. And Dr. Pilny, I hope I'm looking forward to seeing what a next topic will be with you because it's usually something I've never heard of, anticipated, and learned a tremendous amount from. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you.
Um,
Take care.
thank you. And everyone have a great weekend. All the best to you and your flock. Till next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.